Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. I'm coming to you from the Philippines, and it is an absolute privilege to speak with UN Special Rapporteur David Kaye. David, it is so good to see you. It is the last day of 6 years, and what a privilege. Thank you for all of the work that you have done.
Oh, Maria, thank you so much. And I obviously have to start by thanking you for joining me today. It's true, this is my last day as Special Rapporteur, and I'm super excited to talk about it and to talk about the work that you've done and the pressures you've faced over the last several years as well. It's been really an honor to work with you over these many years.
I was just thinking 2014, which was when you took this post. I mean, this is the year when everything it began this turn upside down, when we moved from censorship to scarcity to abundance. And one of the things I've loved while watching you and then working with you is how somehow you were so agile. You always not just dealt with the problems that were there in the moment, but you were always at the forefront of understanding what was going to happen next. How did you do this at this time of drastic change?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's very nice of you to say. I guess I never necessarily felt that I was at the forefront or in the vanguard of anything in particular. And I think that's because the work of being a special rapporteur is very much a group effort. And from the very beginning, I was able to work with civil society organizations, with individuals, with experts who were themselves very much at the forefront. And these were people around the world. Some of them were with major international NGOs like Article 19 or Access Now, whom I met with very early in my mandate, and they were able to say to me, look, these are the issues that we see, not just today, that are having an impact on digital rights, on access to information, on the media, on journalists, but this is where we think it's heading over the next several years. And so, part of my effort was really to learn from the people who've been studying these issues for many years, to bring them to the fore, to make them issues not only for our traditional stakeholders, that is, let's say governments, those who have the biggest and potentially most problematic impact on freedom of expression, but also on companies and those private actors who have an increasing impact on access to information, on the flow of information, on freedom of expression. So having that exchange with individuals, with experts, with organizations was always key to my work, to enabling me, to the extent it seems that way, enabling me to stay on top of the issues and maybe stay a little bit ahead of them.
I think you definitely did that because your mandate also not only, you kept track of both the physical world and the online and offline. And that's, from the traditional, the people who had power tended to be older and tended to ignore for a long time what was happening online. And I think this is one of the strengths of the time that you were there. I guess the question is, you've seen the trends, you've seen the patterns. While you were doing this, what worried you the most? What kept you up at night?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the issue for this particular mandate, freedom of expression, is that in so many respects, it is everything. It's exactly what you said. It's the physical space and it's the digital space. One of the things that I think became clearer to me over time, but wasn't necessarily as clear in, let's say, 2014, at least to me, was the deep connection between the online and the offline. And that goes to all sorts of issues. That goes to the way in which online space is a kind of forum for harassment, which I would say that early on in the development of the online world, that harassment was seen as, look, that's just online. That is just, people exercising some kind of robust freedom of expression. But I think, as long ago as, at least 10, 15 years ago, people did understand that harassment online wasn't really a kind of exercise of freedom of expression that was without impact. And I think over the last several years, I've certainly seen the way in which harassment, just to give one example, harassment online, such as the kind of trolling that you've received for many years, that you've been on, you've been subjected to in the Philippines and elsewhere, that kind of harassment actually has both online effects and offline effects. It has the effect online of seeking to silence marginalized voices. And I think that part of the dynamic wasn't as clear. I don't think it was as clear to the companies, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even a few years ago. And I think at the same time, the way in which online harassment was translated and converted into offline harms was less clear. It was clear to a lot of people. For example, my colleague in the United States, Professor Danielle Citron, has been studying this for many years in the context of sexual violence, of gender-based violence. But I think that it's become clearer and clearer that online harassment, or we could talk about it as online interference with voting rights or with elections, that has definite offline harms. And that, I think that trend line has become clearer and clearer to people over time. But as far as what keeps me up at night, or what kept me up at night, or what concerned me about, maybe put it this way, because I'm on the West Coast of the United States, so a lot of things were already happening by the time I would wake up, would be what was happening in the real world, in the physical space, which is also a real world. And I remember early in January of 2015, waking up to the news of the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris, followed by the massacre in a kosher market in Paris as well. And it was that kind of connection between the online, the expressive part of public space, and the potential for violence that really, I think, has concerned me, continues to concern me today.
Over the years talking to you about this, because that's what I lived. It really is like, and I think journalists, we've seen the trend during the time you've had the mandate. Journalists have come under attack increasingly, and the first attacks are online, and these types of, I think the information is power type of thing, that the way that facts have now become debatable. And I guess this is something you said early on. You said that, yes, you work with governments, but now increasingly private companies have had tremendous power. I would argue private companies now have more power than governments in many instances, especially when these social media platforms are the world's largest distributor of news, right? So we've gone through from the time when, I think you mentioned you were coming in after Snowden, when Edward Snowden did all of these, the expose that frankly was being done by government. Now you can argue that those same things are even larger in scope. The problem's larger in scope, except it's now, the power is now being held by American Silicon Valley companies, where you are in California. Mm-hmm. How do we handle this?
Yeah, that's the, I don't know what the figure is these days for, that used to be $1 million question. It's certainly a $1 trillion question. How do we handle this new space? And I think it's important for us to recognize that because I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking about the platforms as the only vector for harassment. And that's, to a certain extent, it's true. I mean, the platforms have, as you just said, they have enormous power. They have enormous power in particular in places where there is not a robust independent media. They have particular power even in democratic societies where there is robust independent media, when the disinformation that we see online gets amplified by by legacy media, particularly by broadcast media. So there's this real, I think, warranted attention on what's happening in digital space and what the platforms do, what their policies are. I mean, as you mentioned, I wrote a book on this, but I think also that we cannot ignore the fact, and we should continue to focus on the fact, that governments continue to have massive power. They have the coercive authority of the state. They have the regulatory power. They are quite often, and I'm often concerned that we didn't, in the mandate, devote as much attention to this as we should. But on a very much on a daily basis, governments would look to social media. They would say, what are our citizens? What are people within our jurisdiction tweeting about? What are they posting on Facebook? What is the YouTube video of the day that they are liking or sharing or creating? And they would go either to the company and say, take this down. We have a significant lack of transparency around that relationship between government demands and what companies do, although that's improved over the time of my mandate. But they also go directly after individuals. They go directly to the person like you who is actually producing content. And that kind of harassment, that direct, government harassment, that persecution of individuals is still very much a live part of freedom of expression space. And so, although I do think we need to spend a significant amount of time thinking about how governments should regulate the companies, we should also be able to keep in mind the fact that governments remain, I think, the most significant abusers of free expression rights of individuals around the world. Oftentimes they're using the platforms, kind of weaponizing them for their own purposes as well, but they are definitely using that space for surveillance, for attack on speakers, and for other real interferences with freedom of expression. And you've experienced this directly yourself.
No, absolutely. And I guess let's start first with governments, then let's go to companies, and then all of the other things that have everything to do with tech, right? The algorithms that determine what we even see, how our data. So on the government side, your mandate was the time when we began to see a dictator's playbook come together, and the rise of these authoritarian populist style leaders who used social media. They were elected and democratically elected, and then began to use those physical world things, to use the tools of democracy to consolidate power, using not just the real power of government, but also amplifying their power through the new technology that was available. What was it like to work with governments during this time period? And because that's significantly different, right? And then, what worked most effectively?
It's such a great question, and I want to put a pin in this also because I want to circle back to your own experience and talk to you about that, because I think that will be really. Because your experience was one of those, your continuing experience, frankly, is one of those that has really informed my understanding of the issues that we're talking about today. I would say, it's not really possible to characterize interactions with governments as one thing only, because there's such diversity in the way governments behave toward toward this space of, towards digital space, towards independent media, and so forth. So, for example, you have some governments like, I would say some of the Scandinavian governments, some, other European governments that have been very open in their way of thinking about digital space, very open about what they understand. And here, like, to get into a little bit of a, international human rights law distinction, we often talk about negative and positive rights, right? What government, to put it like bluntly, what government is obligated not to do, and then also what government should do in an active way to enable particular environments for the enjoyment of human rights. And I think there are some governments that still see their role primarily as enabling freedom of expression, right? Creating a regulatory environment that is very, very light, if at all, on regulating content, but very strong on, providing, say, public service media, public broadcasting, supporting independent voices. Like those kinds of governments, those are the governments that are, I think, traditionally in the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. They're in that space where they genuinely believe and implement, the essential features of freedom of expression. Those governments are pretty easy to work with. They've been supportive of the mandate. I would especially highlight the government of Norway, governments like Netherlands, Austria, others that have been real robust supporters of the work that we're doing. And I would also say that the European Commission, which actually provided a grant to my mandate and to a couple of others at OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, also has been very supportive of our work. And we could talk more about regulation in the European context as well. But I would distinguish that from the kind of heavy-handedness that we've seen in places like the Philippines, with its cyber law, cyber crime regulation, which is being abused to target a person, an independent journalist like you, or governments like Turkey or Egypt or others that are, quite regularly interfering with digital space, with independent media, going so far in those two examples, Turkey and Egypt, but many others, going so far as to detain journalists merely for their posts or their likes on social media. So I think over the course of my mandate, I've tried to distinguish those, but at the same time recognize that the rights apply across the board. Everybody enjoys rights, and the obligations apply to all states. And to give just one of our most recent examples in special procedures, that is, the branch in which all special rapporteurs kind of work with in OHCHR, China has been, we've almost ignored China to a certain extent over the years because its intense pressure on freedom of expression has been so evident to people. But I think that, and I'm overstating by saying that we've ignored it, but it's come to a particular head over the last few years with the incredible, I think, crimes against humanity that involve freedom of expression, with respect to the Uyghur community in the far West, or what we're seeing right now in Hong Kong. And we are sort of trying to direct more and more attention to that and try to ensure that the international human rights community places a particular value on ensuring freedom of expression, even in that space that is so difficult to advocate for. So, it's just such a variety of governments. It's hard to put them all into one basket and say our interactions with governments are this or that thing.
No. You did. I was slightly disappointed because it did take, you're right that you did talk about EU, the Norway, and all. But in general, when journalists were under attack, and partly after the election of President Trump in the United States, when we were trying to fight for freedom of expression, for freedom of the press, it took until July of 2019 when Canada and Britain began pulling governments together to stand up for it, like actively to help protect journalists like us who've been under threat. And that's very welcome. Also, Article 19 was there at that meeting in London, right? I guess I'm on the part of the digital authoritarians. What worked best with them? Because in general, again, it seems like we're in an Alice in Wonderland world where everything is upside down. And when you take the phrase freedom of expression, it changed drastically. What worked best when you deal with things like that? And you mentioned some of those countries already.
Yeah, maybe if we could just take a second and I can ask you also about your experience, because I think that would sharpen, I do think it would sharpen this question, because I think what you've experienced, I think in a way that people recognize worldwide now, but I think was new to people a couple of years ago, was the intersection of government repression and intimidation, and the misuse, though I don't really like the term weaponizing, but the development of basically troll armies to harass you and to silence you. And I wonder if you could, so as we move into that discussion of kind of digital authoritarianism, what has your experience been? And maybe if I can ask you a question, when did the pressure on you start? I assume it was soon after you founded Rappler.com. Like what did that look like? Because you started it before Duterte came to power. What did that look like? How has that evolved? Because I think your experience is a kind of quintessential experience that people, independent journalists, face everywhere.
It paralleled the rise. We started Rappler in 2012, and the goal there, we embraced technology to build communities of action. So it was really, investigative journalism coupled with tech, and then using that, we could build communities. And the end goal was to make our world better, right? Like everything else. That was 2012. Yeah. I think everything changed, and we didn't realize this, but in 2014, you can see kind of globally, you can see this push towards leaders who could just take away the problem of the complexity of the world. And I'll look at like India and then Indonesia, large populations, right? And so there was that human thing that the world had just gotten so complex that, I can't think through it all. Please just give me a leader who will tell me what to do. And we saw that shift. When I covered the Indonesian elections between Jokowi and the son-in-law of former President Suharto, who had been in power for 32 years. When in the Philippines, we didn't come under attack until 2016. And I think 2016 is when all the dominoes began to fall. And I would say the Philippines was, because we were a testing ground for a lot of these tactics of mass manipulation. The election of President Duterte, I would say, is legitimate. Absolutely. He did use social media. He was the first to use it to win the top office. But in 2016, we began to question impunity of the drug war, a brutal drug war, and impunity of a propaganda war. And this is where it all began. And I think, unlike you, I'm really convinced, because of what we've lived through, that it begins with these lies that are seeded to attack journalists, human rights activists, in our case, also opposition politicians. So the attacks against me began online first, after we published a 3-part series, The Propaganda War, where we actually showed you what was happening, because we live on social media. So we felt the tenor change immediately, and it was in 2016. After Duterte, remember, Duterte was elected in May, and then Brexit happened a month later, and then that's when the rest of the dominoes fell. Our three-part series was that the weaponizing the internet. The second was how Facebook algorithms impact democracy, because that early we really could see it and feel it. And then the third was manufactured consensus, how 26 fake accounts could influence 3 million others. We manually counted that, and that horrified me. And we were essentially alpha partners of Facebook, so I brought this data to Facebook. Anyway, when we published the series, all of a sudden, that's when I got pounded with 90 hate messages per hour. And that continued. And you said this, the end goal of that is to pound you to silence. So that takes a journalist out. And it was so new that we didn't know what it was. No one knew how to deal with it. We learned. And then the second part is to create a bandwagon effect that wasn't real. I mean, Oxford University coined manufactured consensus. That makes sense to me now. But how it changed over time was more interesting to me, right? This, I've talked to you about this, how journalist equals criminal. You pointed out this is used everywhere around the world, but in our case, that narrative was seeded on social media in 2016. In 2017, the astroturfing bottom up was met top down by President Duterte saying the same thing. And that was pounded 1 million times. So more and more people were getting slowly sandwiched. The air is coming out. Then in 2018, weaponizing the law, 11 cases and investigations. 2019, arrests, 8 arrest warrants, 2 arrests in 5 weeks, detention. And then 2020, these cases have been ongoing. And then in 2020, a conviction in June 15th. So journalist equals criminal, which was far-fetched in 2016, because I thought, wow, I've been a journalist a long time. There's a whole track record. Doesn't matter. Track record doesn't matter, because you recreate reality online. And I guess we can talk more about why facts are debatable. But then by 2020, here it is. A court has convicted, and journalist equals criminal. That's crazy, David. So how do we protect? This has also been one of the things you've had to deal with. More and more journalists coming under attack, trying to hold power to account.
Brilliant summation of the last several years that you've lived. And one of the things that I think is really important about what you just described is this accretion of repressive moves, right? So on the one, it starts with investigative reporting. I mean, this is something that I've seen also around the world. It could be investigative reporting. It could also be independent bloggers who are either reporting or doing opinion work that is somehow out of the mainstream. So it starts with content, with expression that is somehow at odds with the conventional sense of what either society or what government wants. And mostly it's about what government wants media to say. So there's that substantive element at the beginning. And then there's, I think what you described is so important, because we've seen this time after time. It's this redefinition of journalism, of the sharing of information as criminal. In a place like Turkey, it's, journalism equals terrorism, right? If you're reporting on the situation of the Kurds, you're a terrorist. If you are reporting on the coup attempt from July of 2016, which is also happening during this period that you're describing, that early period, well, then you're also, you're a Gulenist, you're a part of the coup plotters. So there's this redefinition in law. And I think that is particularly important, because that legal change part of it is also what is then used by government. And this was, I think, a very, nefarious use of this by the government in the Philippines against you, which is they create the law, they allow this law, this cybercrime law, to exist, and then they make it available to individuals, to ostensibly non-governmental individuals, to enforce it against you. And then the government says, what, this isn't about us. I mean, this isn't government action. This is a private actor who is claiming defamation by Maria Ressa and Rappler. I mean, that's clever, right? But ultimately, it is about that change in law. And then when you layer on top of that, the actual, the computational propaganda side, the manufactured consent, the manipulated consent that you describe, which is extra legal, it's a kind of perfect storm. I hate to use that phrase, but it is kind of a perfect storm of kind of government repression mixed with the advent of mass trolling, which is designed to silence opposition, and not just opposition, because my experience has been journalists don't want to be framed as opposition. You're independent actors who are conducting, investigative work, trying to, get at whatever kind of facts and truth you can identify. But, that's undermined by all of these things. And I guess I'm curious, from your perspective, what should be social media, what should be the platform's role? I know in the Philippines, Facebook played a major role in this, but it's not just Facebook. It's in some places Twitter, in others it could be YouTube, in others it could be, WeChat or vContact. It could be any of these different actors out there. And I'm curious or TikTok, what do you think the companies should be doing in the face of what is admittedly, government pressure, government demands?
Yeah, it's interesting when you put it that way. So, like in the Philippines, the penetration of Facebook, 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. It is our internet, but 98% are on YouTube, right? The penetration rate of YouTube, which is the world's second largest search engine, is huge, and they go hand in hand. So it isn't just one thing or another. They're all interconnected. And anyway, so what should they do? So I'm curious to hear what you think, because in my mind now, increasingly, I went early on to say, no, there should be no regulation, because as a journalist, we are self-regulating, right? And we've had a set of standards and ethics that we go by. We protect the public sphere. We are accountable for protecting the public sphere when we distributed the news. Yeah. So I think the first step for me is that the platforms need to own the problem, because journalists, news organizations no longer distribute the news. Technology does. And in many ways, abdicated responsibility for the public sphere, because the way the social media platforms are designed, it doesn't prioritize facts, and there's no accountability for the exponential spread of lies. So behavior-wise, what we've really seen is that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster than the facts, which are really boring. So that's part of it. That one thing has made facts debatable. I think that's the other problem that I see in the design, is that built into the design is us against them. This idea of growth coming from recommending friends of friends has actually divided democracies, divided everyone, and it becomes an us against them, because it's a spectator sport. That's how the cluster, how human behavior has shifted to it. And I guess the most radical thing that I've embraced in the last 4 years is that these platforms are behavioral modification systems. If you take them as a whole, and then let's bring in the rest of what technology's brought in, right? Data privacy, data protection, artificial intelligence. When you take all of that and you combine it with micro-targeting, you can essentially, these platforms know us better than we know ourselves. And they sell our weakest moment to a message, to a company or a government or anyone else, so that we are served that message at the optimum time to change the way we think. So behavioral modification system. I've seen it work in government propaganda. I have not done anything different. Next year will be my 35th year as a journalist, and I am, following the standards and ethics that we always have, and yet journalism is equals crime. I've been convicted. I could go to jail. That's crazy. Enabled by tech, and so that's the struggle for us. And we've leaned on you. For anyone who doesn't know, of course, David Kaye also filed an amicus brief in the cyber libel case that went on trial last year, and on June 15th, I and a former colleague of mine were convicted of cyber libel, a retroactive application of a law. So thank you, David. But his wonderfully written amicus brief, which I got to read, was dismissed by Judge Montesa as noted. One word, noted.
Right. That's true. So before we get to that, on the social media companies and their responsibilities, I think it's a complicated situation for all of us, in part because over time we haven't fully learned what, for example, you mentioned the AI tools that are engaged in providing us and serving us up with information. We have limited insight into how those operate. And from my perspective, I mean, one of the things that we've been trying to call on the companies themselves to do in order to address all of these different problems that you've just described and that we're talking about is to look at these problems and to look at their products, right? To look at their platforms, and by products it could be the AI tools, the algorithmic functioning of their platforms. They have to look at them and ask, what are the human rights implications of every single product that we are presenting to the public, and do basically an impact assessment. We talk about environmental impact assessments for all sorts of projects that might have an implication for the environment or for climate or other issues. We should have those for human rights as well. Those should be standard. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do in the mandate or that I've tried to do as special rapporteur, and that my colleagues, other rapporteurs, have tried to do, is to look at the tool of the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights, which are a non-binding set of standards that say governments have the obligation to protect human rights, but companies, which are not formally bound by human rights law, they do have a responsibility to ensure that their products don't interfere with the human rights of people. And they should have human rights policies. They should have, as part of human rights policy making, they should be transparent about the nature of their products, what they've done to analyze whether those products do have an implication for human rights. They should be able to share all of that information with experts. One thing, if you talk to any researcher in the field of digital rights or of the internet and society, it is extremely difficult to get access to the underlying data that companies have, which is massive, and to actually study the behavioral and human rights implications of those products. Those should be made available to researchers. Once we have that, which we don't have now, I think we're in a better position to really promote and identify specific fixes that should be undertaken by the companies. Right now, we don't have that to a very significant degree, and I think that's been a hindrance in part also, because, and you said this, I think, at the very outset, a lot of the people who are involved in regulating the internet or media around the world, they may tend to be, let's say they've grown up in an environment that is non-technical. that does not involve digital space. And I think that when we start talking about algorithmic transparency, for example, oftentimes those people don't, they don't engage in that conversation. It's a little bit frightening to them to think, oh, this is math, this is going to be hard. But I think we really need to, and this may be a generational change issue, we really need to get to the place where particularly transparency regulation, disclosures by companies becomes a part of the norm that's required by government regulation. That's going to have to be an essential part of how we move forward.
Well, this, using human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights as one of the ways to actually start thinking about for the social media, for these tech companies, Silicon Valley, let's put it that way. In Speech Police, you said they should bring this in. And yes, we've seen some movements. They've hired people who are doing human rights, but beyond that, you're talking about wanting data, but the reality is the impact is already very clear. Researchers can quantify the data and come up with more nuanced reactions. But that's, I guess, if you're like me, you want it right now. We know, you know this in your book, in Myanmar, it's been proven. The UN did their own report. Marzuki Darusman from Indonesia led that team and proved that social media was a factor in genocide, right? The stuff that's happened in other parts of the world, this is already proven. No one is held accountable, and human rights are frankly trampled. My human rights have been trampled. What do we do in the short and medium term?
Yeah, this is really important, and this is why there's so many different discussions around the impact of social media, right? So one is the algorithmic and the manufactured consent that you were describing, and then there's the other, which is, and Myanmar provides a really good example. And in fact, I think over the last couple of months, looking at the debate, how the debate has changed in the United States, provides an interesting set of insights around this as well. So in the case of Myanmar, Facebook, but this is true of all platforms, they have extraordinarily limited insight into what is happening at local levels. And that's not just sort of the national levels, what was happening across Myanmar, or what was happening in Rakhine State, what was happening to the Rohingya community. It's also at the, what Chinmay Arun calls the hyper-local. It's what was happening at the level of, towns and villages where people are using these tools in order to share information. Some of the information they're sharing might be disinformation. A good portion of it, particularly in the Myanmar context, was information about where the next threat of violence might be coming from. So it could be protective. But the problem was, because of the platform's just complete dominance of information in that space, they had a special responsibility, and continue to have a special responsibility to, one, ensure that local communities have some kind of ownership of the platform. What that means exactly is up for some very serious thinking and debate. But right now, local communities and national communities have virtually no ownership of this, these sets of major tools, these major platforms of public space, of public debate. It's like, I imagine this as, a situation where you have, a dominant public forum, and it's all being run by people who have no idea about what that public involves. And we need to get to a point where, there's often a discussion, and this just happened in the United States yesterday, discussion of antitrust and breaking up companies. To a certain extent, I think we should also be talking about whether the companies need to be somehow broken down. Like, how do we get them to be closer to the communities where they're actually regulating public debate, where they're actually regulating public space? That for me is a real major problem. And I think we've seen this in an odd way in the United States over the development of the Black Lives Matter protests. So, I think Rashad Robinson did a fireside chat earlier in the week for RightsCon, and what he's done and with Anti-Defamation League and with others in terms of highlighting the role that the platforms play in spreading hate. That's been extraordinary, and it's really gotten the attention of advertisers in the United States. But what's remarkable to me is that this is only happening now. This kind of action against, in that case, against Facebook, it's only happening now. So employees are now, the companies are kind of organizing themselves and complaining about the way executives are making decisions on issues like hate speech and racism and white supremacy on the platform. But, for Facebook, the platform is global. Only about 10% of the platform is its user base is in the United States. So where has been the outrage over all of these other kinds of issues, particularly the kind that you've described in the Philippines? Where's been the outrage, the action when it comes to the global situation? And I think that's something that it's not just the companies, but we as advocates, as researchers, we need to come to terms with. This is, we're not just talking about problems in one particular space. We're talking about this happening. We're talking about, for example, the impact of Facebook on the U.S. elections. Yeah. Well, it's happening everywhere. It happens in the elections in the Philippines. It happens in elections in India. I mean, you can go on and on about where it's having that impact. And the discussion tends to be limited to those environments. And there's not a lot of response from the companies in the way that we're seeing the response right now in the United States.
Yeah, and actually that's why it's so. The few things that you said, number one, how do they get to know the communities? Well, when I had to set up the Jakarta Bureau, I spent months, years understanding the legal system and the communities that I was going to be reporting about. And even as a reporter, I couldn't really, there's always a gap between a Western news organization and the Southeast Asian countries that I was reporting on. And that just took time. So I think in some ways what you mentioned, which is how will these platforms, how will these companies understand the local communities? It takes time. And the problem is that they did not invest in the people and they did not invest in time, because exponential growth that allowed for more money also meant that they did a one-size-fits-all, and the countries like Myanmar, like the Philippines, are not there. We're not, despite all of the negative effects. I always say, the global South deals with Silicon Valley's decision. So that's the first. How do you get them to deal with community? Sure, they've hired more people who speak the language, but that's not even it. So, and then the second thing you mentioned, stop hate for profit, right? The whole goal of all of these exponential attacks is to incite hate. I think, again, over the last 4 years, I've just been recently showing all of the things that are meant to dehumanize me. I see it, I wake up to it. And when I show this to the public, to something that people get shocked because it's so visceral and demeaning. That is what it's meant to do. So yes, I'm thrilled Sacha Baron Cohen did that. The Anti-Defamation League is doing that work, but the journalists, women in particular, because in the Philippines, for example, women are attacked 10 times more than men. This is what we're living through, and the end goal of all of that inciting to hate can lead to violence. This is what I worry about for Rappler and for our team. Online violence leads to real world violence, something else that we know, right? This is already a given. How do we get some sense of, how do we get some protection?
Yeah, on this last point, on the impact on women journalists in particular, and the kind of, I think, imbalance in terms of attacks. I'll just give one example, or it could be two examples, actually. So over the last several years, I've collaborated closely, as I think people know, with Agnès Callamard, who's the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings and summary executions. We've collaborated in the context of the attacks on the media in the Philippines, and we've also collaborated in the context of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post correspondent, opinion journalist, who was murdered by Saudi officials. You know, I think it certainly appears with the involvement of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So in those contexts, we've both been pretty vocal about our concerns, both of government repression, government intimidation, and the role of other governments in their silence and in the context of social media. In each of those contexts, Agnès is the one who has suffered the most in terms of trolling, attacks online, basically Twitter campaigns against her. And I, you know, as I think a white male who's also involved in this, I have not received the same kind of attack. It's just, I think, an example of the way in which this attempt at silencing is not only prevalent, you know, against journalists, but also human rights workers, and it has I think, a differential impact often on women in these cases. So I mean, I think what we're talking about when we talk about harassment and silencing, it's clearly not just about silencing of journalists and investigative people in the field of human rights, but also, you know, people who are doing the work as mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to collect information and report it to the international community.
Yes, I think, again, the work the two of you have done have been amazing. Can I bring you back, because we're running out of time. We have a few minutes,
Yeah.
and I definitely want to have last words. But one last big question I have is, again, it goes back to this idea of how facts are now debatable, how we have alternative realities. To hear that come out of the White House was also interesting for me, right? But in a time like that, where we know we are being actively manipulated, geopolitical power play has gone down to the individual level. And when it is like that, is it even possible to have a democracy? Do we have integrity of elections if we don't have facts?
Yeah, I mean, Maria, that is a huge question, right? And I think that all too often we're not having that conversation. You know, we're not having that conversation about the way in which, well, let me maybe step back a little bit and be a little bit more specific. You know, Mark Zuckerberg gave a big kind of reported talk at Georgetown last year, where he talked
Yes.
about the commitment of Facebook to freedom of expression. And I think that's, you know, I think that's valuable. I'm obviously, as Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, to hear a CEO of a platform say freedom of expression is essential to our work, you know, that's heartening, that's nice. The problem is, and I think this isn't just a Zuckerberg problem or a Facebook problem, but it's a problem perhaps for social media, and also maybe for all of our understanding of what freedom of expression is. I mean, the way Zuckerberg talked about freedom of expression, and also, frankly, the way the debate over Trump's tweets that really were on the edge, if not involving incitement to violence during the Black Lives Matter protests, I think the assessment was somehow that because he's a politician, he has a particular right to speak that is different from the ordinary citizen's right to speak. And I think that's actually not the right way to think about freedom of expression. And I mean, this gives me a chance to you know, quote Article 19 of the National Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which again echoes the Universal Declaration. And Article 19 guarantees everyone the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. But that core, it's about seeking and receiving information in addition to imparting it. So it's not just about the speaker. Freedom of expression is also about the audience. And I don't want to overstate this because, like as you mentioned at the beginning, you were wary of regulation at the outset, and I'm very wary of regulation around disinformation, in particular because it's often used by authoritarian governments to shut down independent journalism. False information, prosecutions, and so forth that we've seen around the world. But I think it's important for the companies to conceptualize freedom of expression, not just as the right to post, but also to conceptualize it as an understanding of what it is that individuals are capable of receiving. And disinformation on the platforms, as you've described it, in the context of, manipulated consent, trolling, which the companies, I think, at the working level understand is a problem that they have to deal with. And we see this in different ways. But freedom of expression also involves our right of access to information. And the kind of trolling, the kind of intimidation, the kind of disinformation that we've been talking about and that we see regularly is a form of interference with the freedom of expression that we all enjoy. And I think that conceptualization is really critical to understanding what it is that companies should do to address it. And that goes to, disinformation around elections, disinformation around candidates, and so forth. And the companies just need to be devoting a huge amount of resources to that, to the transparency of advertising that's political, to all sorts of other issues that give us insight to who is behind certain kinds of content that really involves disinformation and is not about kind of promoting the public square, public debate, and access to information. I think that's really important for us to wrap our heads around.
I think it's also clear, the rules that we live by in the real world, what they should work online in many ways. When you attack somebody, a lot of the things that you talked about, in some ways are still looking at content moderation. I'm now a fan of regulation because I think it's the only thing that can do something, but not necessarily content. Right? We are running out. We have 2 minutes left, and I guess you've had a great mandate over a transformational period of time. Let me give you, your closing thoughts, and as you move on, you're still going to be with us, of course, and we're looking forward to still working together. But I guess how do you think of it on the last day? What things have worked, and what things do we need to work on?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to summarize in just a minute or two, but I think a key issue is almost more of a tactic. It's not a strategy, but the promotion of freedom of opinion and expression is a group effort. It's not within my power or any special rapporteur's power. I mean, even to say we have power is a bit of a joke because we don't have power necessarily. But I think that we have the ability to serve as a platform for voices that are often not heard, to serve as a platform for ensuring that these issues, which are not just national issues, these are global issues that we're talking about, and they require a kind of, not strict consistency, but they do require, certainly for the companies, a global approach. And I think that, as a tactic, it is essential to continue to involve civil society in all of these discussions. And I guess my fundamental plea to governments, particularly those at the Human Rights Council, is that those governments create space for civil society to participate, that they create space for independent media, that they approach regulation not from the perspective of content only, but from the perspective of how we ensure that people have adequate information to make decisions about the future of digital space.
No, thank you. Agree with all of it, all of your insights. I mean, I'm going to quote Quinn McHugh from Article 19 when she described your intellectual fierceness. I like that phrase. We are at the end of our time. David, thank you so much, and thank you for the privilege of having this conversation with you at the end on your last day as on your UN mandate. 6 years, an incredible 6 years, and hoping that we find the way forward. Now, I have skin in the game on that
Maria.
one. I'm Maria. Thank you.
Thanks.